Welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and the bad idea that I'm going to be talking about this week has a cool name. Project Orion. It sounds like a Tom Clancy book.
It really does. It's got that, especially because it's got that Cold War feel to it.
And it starts in the Cold War, Tony. This actually kind of kicks off with the kickoff of the space race. Right? In 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik into Earth's orbit. And this is kind of a wake-up call for America, because America hadn't realized at the time exactly how far along the Soviets were in their space age exploration study. So when the Soviets beat us into orbit, we realized we were doing some stuff wrong. And one of the things that we realized we were doing wrong is that all of our space expertise, as it were, was spread across the different branches of the military. So you had the Air Force because, things fly and so it goes into space, must be Air Force. And you had the Navy because they're called spaceships. And you had the Army because, when we get to the moon, we got to put some guys up there, have guns or whatever. I don't know what the Army's excuse was. They just wanted to be part of it.
What about the Marines? Were they into it? Did we want jarheads in space?
The Marines are part of the Navy, Tony.
Don't tell them that.
But they realized that they needed to focus if we were going to catch up and exceed what the Soviets were doing. And so we created ARPA, which is the Advanced Research Projects Agencies, now known as DARPA. They added a D in the beginning, I think for defense or something.
Yeah, because it's always defense whenever you're developing those sorts of weapons.
Yeah, we're going to defend ourselves by launching a nuke on top of your head. And this was founded to consolidate American knowledge about space travel into one place. And one of the ideas that comes out of this ARPA thing is this Project Orion. Now, the seed idea for Project Orion had been initially proposed by a mathematician named Stanislaw Ulam. And he had been part of the original nuclear bomb testing at Los Alamos. He had been working on that project. And the first time that he saw a nuclear weapon go off, a light went on in his head. And he said, you know what we can do with this thing? We can put stuff in space with it.
I mean, it is a lot of energy.
It is a ton of energy. And Project Orion was, in essence, a spaceship powered by nuclear bombs.
Whenever you say a spaceship powered by nuclear, people are probably thinking, it's got a nuclear reactor for power or something like that. No, this is full-on explosions of nuclear weaponry to propel an object into space, right?
You would drop full-sized nuclear bombs out the back of this thing, one at a time, and blow them up. 1 per second, by the way, is the sort of accepted speed at which these things will get ejected from the back end of this thing. 1 nuclear bomb per second gets kicked out the back end of a spaceship, blows up. They also usually, the idea would be to throw something else back there just to act as something to kick forward into the spaceship. So the acceleration would happen a little bit more efficiently. And you have this giant plate on the back of your ship that the explosion pushes against, and you go into space, Tony.
See, I could see this actually working better in space because a bunch of radiation and so on isn't going to be that bad. It's like pouring a glass of water into the ocean. But to get it actually into space seems like a terrible idea.
Well, we'll talk about the radiation a little bit. I did want to mention, though, this idea of powering some kind of space travel had actually been proposed before, not with nuclear weapons, but very early on in sort of the exploration of flight, let's say. In 1881, there was an explosives expert that proposed this possibility of throwing explosives out the back of a craft, blowing them up, and pushing the craft forward. And even earlier than that, in 1865, Jules Verne wrote From the Earth to the Moon, which was about a spacecraft that was powered by a huge explosion that kicked it out of a giant rifle barrel. So this wasn't a completely new idea, but adding nuclear explosives was new. And here's why this was important. Because as crazy as this sounds on the face of it, nuclear power is incredibly efficient. It's one of the most efficient uses of energy in the universe. The only thing better than nuclear power is like a matter-antimatter annihilation.
That's a little out of our reach for a bit.
At the moment, yes. And so what would happen here, I wrote down some of the math and the scientific terms, but I don't think people are really interested in that. What this makes possible is that you can send massive spaceships from the Earth's surface into orbit. In fact, you almost have to send massive spaceships if you want people to be on them. Because if you explode a nuclear bomb and use that energy to push your spaceship forward, if that spaceship is not very heavy, Tony, you're going to just flatten whoever's inside of it with the gravitational forces.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, did you have any math on how many Gs it would be pushing for a smaller ship?
100.
Yeah, that would be death. Like, your ribs would just explode out of you.
Well, they were talking about 100 as sort of an upper bound for unmanned.
I see.
They figured you could send some probes out with these and you could maybe get up to 100. I'm guessing the nuclear bombs could probably go higher than that, but even the computers would be breaking over 100.
Yeah, you're going to liquefy people and just break all your components.
So Project Orion was worked on from 1957 to 1965 at General Atomic, which was a subdivision of the General Dynamics Corporation. And the idea behind this was actually a really good one. The aim of the General Atomic Division was to use nuclear power for peaceful pursuits. And I think that must have been very encouraging for these scientists who had mostly all anyway, worked at Los Alamos, building bombs, working for the military, and seeing what they had done turned into the most horrifying weapon that humans have ever created. You know, I mean, we've all heard the Oppenheimer speech about "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," and I think that there was that sobering effect on all of these guys, and the opportunity to use that knowledge for something that wasn't killing people and breaking things in the most destructive way possible was probably very appealing. And the early days of this project were very sort of unrestrained. And it's similar to Los Alamos as well. The book I read about this, I was not able to finish the entire thing, but it was written by the son of one of the men who worked on this project. And he talked about how that essentially they were working with these new ideas and new technology that nobody had ever worked with before, and the government was just throwing money at them. And there was ostensibly some kind of oversight process, but essentially, if, George Feynman said, "I think I want to blow up a hamster," the guys up top would let him do it. I'm making a joke about the hamster, but honestly, these guys understood so much more about nuclear power than the people giving them their orders ever would, that they probably could have gotten almost anything by them. So they have almost unlimited resources, and they are the unlimited intellects of the day. That some of the guys that they talked about working on this project, one of them finished high school too early to go to college and went directly into working on Project Orion. He worked on it and was the head of the project for so long that they got embarrassed that he didn't have a PhD and made him quit for a year or two to go to get his PhD so he could come back and be like legit.
That's some elitism, but I guess whenever you're talking about nuclear weapons, you kind of want that.
Well, it's hard to say, here's the high school student, to the senator coming to browse your progress. It's hard to say, here's the high school student we hired to be the head of this entire thing because he's the best at miniaturizing fission bombs.
I mean, I'd be like, it's Doogie Howser. I guess that's like another 30 years.
It wasn't. Yes, he was the inspiration for Doogie Howser. I don't think he was quite that young. I think he was like 16 at the time. As I mentioned, one of the problems with Orion was how big the ships had to be for it to be even workable, because of the massive force imparted by the blast. And so one of the things that Project Orion started working on was making smaller bombs. They said, okay, if we make these nuclear weapons smaller and they have less of a kiloton output, then we can make our spaceship smaller. However, on the other hand, size is kind of the point of this project, this was never meant to be equivalent to one of our rockets that we know of. The fact that the forces made possible by nuclear weapons would have allowed for ships the size of cities to be launched, and not only like into orbit, but into the far reaches of the solar system and beyond. That was one of the main draws of this idea. I mean, we're kind of puttering around, maybe getting out to Saturn with a probe, if we're lucky, with the current chemical rocket technology. But the promise of Project Orion was that you could think about something like an interstellar arc and actually build it. We have the technology right now to build an entire city and launch it into orbit with technology that we currently have, as long as you're willing to blow up some nukes.
I mean, if it was a real dire situation and that was like humanity's lifeline, why not?
I do think about, I while researching it, I thought about it in those terms of what if we have like a year to get out of the way of an asteroid and there's no way to push the asteroid out of the way. Maybe we could do something like this in a pinch. That's where my mind goes, and it's possible. As you mentioned earlier, Tony, the most obvious problem with dropping nuclear bombs to launch a spaceship is the potential for fallout. However, I was surprised to learn that that danger isn't quite as great as you might expect. One of the mathematicians working on this project calculated how dangerous the fallout from this launch would be, and he said, based on what he was able to figure, for every launch, you would guarantee basically one person dies from a fatal dose of cancer. And that's, like, I hate to be callous, like, one life is important, right? But we do a lot of things that in the aggregate might kill, you know, a person here or there, and we don't necessarily stop ourselves from doing it because it's not safe for a person.
Yeah, it's the idea of like the greater good.
Yes, whether or not that's right or not, it's not necessarily just the giant cancer factory you would expect.
Yeah, like it's not like Chernobyl levels where it's poisoning entire cities and things like that every time you launch one.
Yes. Another problem with this was that when you detonate a nuke, you get an electromagnetic pulse. That's a real thing. It's not sci-fi. For those of you who've heard of it in sci-fi, can be made for real, and one of the ways you make it is by detonating a nuke. However, even in those circumstances, electronics can be hardened against EMP, and if you launch this thing pretty far out in the desert, you can probably minimize the damage to electronics that you would do. If you're far enough away from civilization, this doesn't have to be super critically damaging.
But it would be terrible for your cell reception out there, though, if you were working out there.
I did think about that as well. What is the infrastructure for building and launching this thing? Because you're going to have people with computers out there. They're gonna need people to feed them. There's got to be like supply chains going out there by the time you build this whole thing up out in the desert. What's the point of moving it out there if you're just going to have to blow all that up anyway? I don't know, Tony.
You also know the guy that's going to get the lethal dose of radiation is probably the guy working at like the airport-style Taco Bell.
The guy who got the lethal dose of radiation actually worked on this project, interestingly enough. There was a dude who was assembling an atomic bomb and put a piece in the wrong way. He dropped it in too quickly, and he had a death sentence. He knew he was dying of brain cancer from this slip up, and he wanted to be a part of this project, Project Orion. It's very tragic. Although they did learn from him, it's like, we're not going to put the final piece in from the top anymore because gravity accelerates it to the point where it creates a real bad collision and produces a bunch of atomic particles. So we're going to go from the side.
Yeah, that seems like something that should have been thought out before, but hindsight's 2020.
Yes, these were very smart people, Tony. I'm going to assume that if they didn't think of it beforehand, I might not have either.
No, definitely not.
There are some technical issues with launching a ship like this. Specifically, and you can sort of figure this out for yourself, right? When you blow up an atomic bomb, the force is so great that everything on the ship needs to be able to withstand that shockwave. That plate that you're blasting into with the shockwave can't be falling apart and blasting pieces into the front part of the ship. But those are things that were being and could be, I think, worked out. It was just sort of minor technical hiccups that they didn't have the full resources to test. They were never able to test a full scale version of this with actual nukes. So some of this had to be theoretical for them. I read that many of the things that they wanted to know, like how they would react, could be tested in computers these days, but they didn't have access to that technology at the time.
I really wonder what materials they would have used, like what metal would have been able to withstand multiple nuclear blasts against it without getting superheated to the point where it's weakened and is able to like make an entire city-sized thing rise up.
Well, there was a couple of interesting things about that. First of all, despite the fact that the blast is super hot, it's also super short. Even though you're dropping one of these per second, you're flash heating this, and it's kind of like running your hand through a candle flame. The heat there might not necessarily cause a lot of problems. As far as the sort of force of the blast, I think it's just a matter of making this plate thick enough and of the correct material. And one of the things they were concerned about in their testing that they did with conventional explosives, they said, well, what if we sort of start to wear away this plate with our explosions? They found out that something that stops that from happening is oil. They had touched the plate in places where they were testing this, and the spots where their fingerprints were, where they had gotten their skin oil on the plate for the blast, just for the conventional explosives, those didn't wear away, whereas the exposed metal did. Very interesting, and I don't know what it means, little detail, but I did want to mention that since you asked about how durable this thing would be. The thing that ultimately killed Project Orion was really, again, the thing that was its greatest appeal. The government just didn't have a use for a system that could literally launch a city into orbit. They didn't need a city in orbit, Tony. They just wanted to put nukes over Russia. That was really the main thing. And you could do that way easier and way cheaper with chemical rockets. So they knew they were going to the moon and stuff, but even there it wasn't worth it to build one of these nuclear vessels. So the project was basically abandoned. And it was sort of had the final nail in the coffin put in it by the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was passed in 1963. And this banned the testing of nuclear weapons above ground. So you can understand how you can't really test your spaceship that runs on nuclear weapons to go into space underground.
Yeah, and that's probably a pretty hard permit to get through that treaty.
So that essentially killed this project, more or less. There were some other things that came out of this that sort of picked up the mantle, at least in a theoretical sense. In 1973, the British were trying to design a probe that can get to nearby stars, and they proposed Project Daedalus, which was an unmanned version of a probe that would be powered by nuclear technology, similar to what they were using with Project Orion. And in 1987, NASA developed Project Slingshot, which was also a probe, also intended to go to the stars, and also powered by nuclear technologies. Notably, though, both of those ships were planned to be built and launched from orbit, so there wouldn't have been any explosions on Earth to cause problems there. The most interesting proof of concept that was ever created for this happened in 1957 during what was called Operation Plumb Bob. Operation Plumb Bob was a massive battery of nuclear tests that took place. I think they said as many as 28 bombs off. And one of these explosions was inside of a cavity of some kind. And there was a steel plate that was supposed to be on top of this cavity that weighed 2,000 pounds that was not properly fastened down. And this explosion sent the steel plate flying into the atmosphere at a rate of 150,000 miles per hour.
Was there anything left of it?
We never found it.
Okay.
It is escape velocity at 150,000 miles per hour. However, the physicists on the project believe that this thing just disintegrated on its way out of the atmosphere. It was going so fast.
That's probably true. But imagine if there's just some like crazy steel plate flying through space until it eventually runs into something could be millions and millions of years from now.
That would be fun as well. I prefer the version of it where it's still flying around. And I've got to say, Tony, I know the title of the podcast is Bad Ideas, and I know that there are some problems with this concept. After having studied this, I'm not 100% convinced that it's the bad idea that I was hoping it would be. I'm on board with this plan.
We've had this happen a couple times where it's like, this sounds like the worst idea ever, and then it's like, you know what? That could work. That could really work.
You would want to mitigate the fallout as much as you could, and there are ways that they discuss doing that using fusion bombs in particular. If you could find a way to make a pure fusion bomb, those don't have radioactive fallout. So there are some things you could do to get around it. It would require a lot of expenditure of money for something that would essentially be sending many, many people out into space. And I don't think we have the will to do that at this time. But maybe Elon Musk can get on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who want off this planet, though.
That's true. They can go be president to the moon.
Yes.
Or just their own city in space.
I mean, I'd be down for that.
I would too, Tony. But that is all we have for this week on Bad Ideas. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening. If you like this show, you can support us on Patreon. That would really help us out if you would support us on Patreon. For as little as $2 a month, you get access to some cool stuff like the bonus podcast, and me and Tony send you a postcard with some other people's names on it as well from the company. I don't know them really, but they make us have their names on there too, so
yeah,
we got to take
it's
those.
That producer thing. Sometimes you just can't get away from it.
Yeah, this probably is the point where I should mention, linked up with Tony's Milli Vanilli episode, that this has been entirely scripted.
This actually wasn't Tony and Al. This is like Eduardo and Jake here.
Yeah, Tony and Al, listen, their faces are too pretty, but their voices are too ugly, and we just want everybody to give us the real credit. Eduardo and Jake, send us your money on Patreon. We need it.
Yeah.
If you have a bad idea you want us to talk about, you can go to badideashow@gmail.com. Send those on in, and we will see you guys next week with another episode of Bad Ideas.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.